So when you know, only in that there's the light one. So you're saying the leading is clean. So you can say yes.
And also
Yeah.
not hard. The thing that's needed to make
Right.
cut, and I deleting is also a.
Right.
Okay, is this working? Is this working? Okay, let's go ahead and get started.
Wait. Oh.
For those of you who don't know, this is modern. A very exciting topic to save for the last meeting of the week. So here's the note well. We've seen it many times this week. It applies just as much for the end of the week as it does for the beginning of the week. So if you're not familiar, please do familiarize yourself with it. Quick agenda bashing. We moved Chris a little later in the agenda, but they didn't change the the name of the draft. So Chris will be talking about the one that has "went" in the name. Move the John Peterson ones up. I apologize for the failure in moving things around. Any agenda bashing? Besides hoping that we get through it as quickly as possible so that we go do something else. Okay. Let me do. Let's see. So we'll talk about framework first. John. Get used to this.
Hi. I feel like I was just here last session talking about something similar. I see a few familiar faces from that actually still lingering here. Do you mean to be here, Paul, or is this okay, very good. You did. Fair enough. So we're going to talk about the thing that is supposedly articulating what it is we are here to do, this great investigation that we have called modern. Next slide, please. So we developed this document originally as a problem statement that then morphed into a list of use cases and morphed a bit into a framework as well. And now it's just basically a container for those three things. It's gotten pretty extensive. And hopefully, though, those three things are at least relatively aligned because we stuffed them all into the same container. We had a working group last call on this, and I was just astounded by the level of response that we got to it. All right. Yeah, thank you, Chris. So Adam actually read this doc at one point, checked it out a bit. Henning did as well, had a couple comments. And really, during the last call, we issued a minor revision based on some of the comments we received. The main one being that, we can't really talk anymore about things like the assignment and resolution of numbers independently from the credentials that we were talking about in ACME, just in the previous session, and of course in START. And consequently, we just put into the framework the concept of a credential authority who had undoubtedly some relationship to the various national regulatory entities and other relying parties for trusting communications and so on that we articulate elsewhere in the framework. And that kind of makes it so that this is a place where the things we're talking about doing with STIR and ACME and with this TeRi protocol I'll be talking about in a little bit are all kind of explained in one spot, which is kind of nice. We've got like one picture that has all that stuff in it. We probably should have thought of doing that earlier. Henning had asked us to consolidate the use cases a while ago, and I kind of did I did some of that, but not nearly enough. And so I tried to do a bit more of that to get that to be a bit tighter this time. Next slide. I don't know, I would welcome more review of this document. I would certainly not represent this as a document that has had adequate review. That much said, it is just an articulation of use cases and a framework for how these various actors interact and a problem statement. This is not something that by publishing it, we are compelling any implementer anywhere to do anything. So I think we may be in a good position for this now. And I'd propose if no one else feels like reviewing it, that we try to send it on. Does anybody really like have this like burning urge to like delve deeper into the modern problem framework in this room? I see. I don't see a lot of appetite for this. Kind of looking around at the moment. Chairs?
One question Adam had raised, whether we put this through to RFC or not, that there's some IESG rethinking about what documents similar to this, which one should go through to RFC. I don't know, Adam, if you can comment on that.
It's just to put a little more color on it. It's a question of, do you believe this has archival value that would be useful in the future, or is it just going to inform the rest of the work we're doing in modern?
I mean, it declares terminology and things like that. I mean,
okay. So from that perspective, it's probably fine then.
Okay. So then, do we need to do another working group last call, or are the changes minor?
I think it's relatively minor, really. I mean, we added the credential stuff, but that's pretty much it. And again, there are a lot of use cases that were the form like user provisions number at CSP, and then like delegate, provisions number at CSP, and then like CSP provisions number at other CSP, which I have tried to consult because then they just like rubber stamp all the text. I've consolidated those into provisioning number at the CSP and has the little just kind of differences outlined there. So it's stuff like that we did. There's no surgery really in this.
Okay, well, I will suggest to the list that we avoid another working group last call, give people a chance to comment on it there. If there's no pushback, then we can push it through. Does that sound reasonable?
Sure.
Okay. Okay, next up.
It's actually Chris, it's not me, right? That was your...
Chris wanted to go after you.
Oh, okay.
So we can.
Well, then I'll take my bag off. This is the arduous one.
Do you mind?
No.
I thought you could say.
So, standing up here for like one slide worth, I would hold my stuff, but not now. Okay. So now we're going to get into a bit of meat and some new stuff, and this again came out of conversation, unsurprisingly, by the dynamic duo of Chris Wendt and John Peterson, once again, submitting work to Modern, to address a problem that has some currency right now, actually. And this really is an attempt to address the perennial and sometimes justifiable accusation that this has kind of been a fishing trip, right? I mean, that this started, for those of you that don't recall that far back, and it was a ways back at this point, this started from an FCC workshop in North America, where we're kind of speculating on what kinds of tools would be useful to have in future numbering administration. So what kind of motivated this whole exercise. And because of that, we have been facing for some time complaints of, well, what are you really doing that's practically going to change anything about how we do things in the telephone network today? And so this is an example. This is something that seems to be going on now. We don't seem to really have an idea of how we should do it. Seems like the kind of thing we should be able to do with the stuff we've been designing here. So let's see if it works or not, was the thought. Next slide. So first, before we get into that particular use case, this is all based on this thing called TeRi. And it's important to understand TeRi before I really get into this. When I talk about the tools we've been building here that can apply to this use case, TeRi is the tool. This is now our third or fourth revision of TeRi, actually, my third revision. And what TeRi really represents, it stands for telephone-related information, TRI, is an attempt to create an information model that designates who the various actors are involved in the operations of acquiring, managing, and resolving telephone numbers in this hypothetical future architecture that we would like to use. I think since the framework is getting more mature, I think we have a good notion now of kind of what the semantics of TeRi should be. And this is purely a semantic exercise. We have a separate document, as I suggest down at the bottom, that gives a syntax for TeRi in JSON, really just as a straw man so people understand what we're talking about. And I can put messages up and say, this is what it would look like bound to TeRi. But the basic idea behind TeRi was to try to get that agreement on the information model first. What kind of information we wanted to have in queries and responses for TeRi before we got too deeply into the syntax. And that has its own historical roots in endless debates about whether the DNS or web protocol would be more suitable for this. And it seemed at the time the best thing we could do is kind of put that off the table and say, let's just talk about what should be in messages, and we'll worry about how we're going to carry that stuff later. Next slide. So like I said, TeRi is a threefold thing. There are three basic operations that it defines. There's an acquisition operation. This is Rich Shockey's personal favorite. This is something that allows, if you're a consumer, sorry, Rich Shockey is not a fan of this. This is the operation that allows an entity to request a new telephone number from some kind of authority that has an inventory of telephone numbers. Now, there are many ways to stage that. That could mean a communication service provider going to a registrar in a very, kind of DNS-like model, name-like model, where you go to a registrar and you acquire inventory from it. Or it could mean a consumer going to a carrier, or it could mean an enterprise having individual phones connecting up to it that go to the enterprise and acquire a number from the central call computer of the enterprise. So these operations are intended to be that flexible. In other words, we imagine that they're going to be applicable to a wide variety of different use cases. They'll have fundamentally the same semantics. I'm an entity, I'm going to some authority that has some numbering and inventory and saying, give some to me. We have a management operation, which is the question of how you actually provision information about a number. And the fundamental building block of TeRi is something called a record. Records are the kinds of things that you provision and retrieve. They contain information about telephone numbers that might be useful to you in placing calls or in figuring out who owns what. And then there's this retrieval operation, the fetch operation. Were we to look at this like a successor to enum, which sometimes is an accusation that is levied at it. Enum is really scoped to that retrieval operation component. I want to query this service and get back information about a particular number. Retrieval is a bit more flexible in this, and it is coupled again to all these different potential use cases, and we'll talk a bit about some of them here today. But the core conceit of this was that the real blunder we made in enum was when we tried then to figure out how to provision for it. When we did these exercises in drinks, for example, and we're like, well, we're going to create this new object format. We're going to provision the data that will then be consumed by enum. We found that it kind of, they just ended up having different information models. The retrieval protocol did from the management protocol. It was more flexible what you could provision, in other words, than what you could realistically query for, given the way that enum worked. And so the core conceit of TeRi is that you have this common information model based on the record, and that we're studying the ecosystem of the record. If you can provision it, you should be able to query for it. It's a common information model. Next slide. It looks kind of familiar, like if you are like one of those enum guys, because there's like, a bunch of clients, and maybe they go through some kind of a aggregating intermediary, or maybe they don't, but they retrieve these records from service. Records of the service are provisioned by authorities, probably through the management interface. And we imagine authorities are the kinds of entities we talk about in STIR, like people who have certificates that grant them, at least attest their authority over service provider codes, things like OCNs in North America, or telephone numbers themselves. And it's by virtue of holding that credential that you become an authority. Similarly, the basic way the model works, clients don't need to trust services typically. In the sense of, it doesn't matter from whom you get a record. What matters is the signature on the record that was created, that was put on the authority who created the record, in other words. So you can kind of think about it like services are just middlemen in this ecosystem, and that records come into being through the acquisition interface. Numbers are kind of created in the modern ecosystem by that. Then kind of authorities can provision additional records against in these instances, and then clients retrieve them to figure out how to communicate with people. That's the basic idea of all this. Next slide. So as I said, there's these three operations. Each has a request and a response concept. One thing that's actually different, this is the first place I've gotten into something that is new information. I presented all of this before many times. We keep hacking the model, right, as we look at these use cases. And as we looked at this particular use case this time of dealing with valid allocated numbers, which we'll be talking about shortly, one thing that kind of occurred to me is that I've had this previous concept that there are requests that would have a source and a subject, right? The source is the client that's sending the request. The subject is what the request is about. And then I had this thing that was called like attributes. You could have like attributes of a request. And eventually I decided I didn't like having attributes for requests, but instead I wanted to have restrictions for a request. In other words, a restriction rather than just an attribute, which has a much more general semantics. Restriction means if I'm applying this to the request, I want something narrower than you would ordinarily give me if such a thing exists, had I just asked for this without the restriction, right? And so, for example, if you're querying about a particular telephone number for the retrieval interface, and you could do so with no restriction and get whatever information might be available coming from a variety of different sources for a variety of different potential applications. Or you could say, well, look, I only want like the SMS service associated with this telephone number. And what you'll get back from that, if it's possible for a record, you'll get back only records that contain that service, ultimately is what it comes down to. Now, there are other authorization decisions that are made about the policy of this, and we can talk a bit about authorization policy in TeRi as well. But that's one change to the model since the last time I talked about it, is now requests don't have attributes anymore. They just have restrictions. They always are being made more narrow by adding these qualifiers to them. Yes, Chris.
Just quick question. So when you say restrictions, is that any different than just narrowing? You have a data record and I only want one object within it, or is there policy implications that you're thinking there, or I just want to
It's not so much policy implications.
clarify.
Again, the records that you return, or the records that this request applies to, are limited to those that contain this element that I'm restricting the request to. And so, no, it's not, I wouldn't say that it's a policy restriction as such. It's much more, yes, of like a
programmatic,
programmatic.
a query with parameters that say, give me only this, or
Give me only this, yes. Give me only things that match this. And
because I keep trying to bring things back to CRUD and keep things simple. So.
I have a SCRUD slide. I have a SCRUD. That's the difference, that I have an S. But the S matters in this, I think, because there are sets of records that will end up applying to most of the requests that we care about. And you can think about it like the purpose of restrictions is to give the client a way to reduce the set that's likely to receive. Or to receive nothing if there's nothing applicable, which might be exactly the right thing to have happen. And that's what response codes are like. If you send a request for something and there are no suitable records, you'll get back a response code saying, I got nothing. There are similar things about unauthorized access to records. There, of course, is a success response. But yeah, the basic idea is for the retrieval-ish, enum-ish case, right, when you send a request, a successful response will contain one or more records that'll be useful to you in doing what it is you want to do in life. Next slide. So this is kind of what I've got in mind anyway. And I have this really quick and dirty like JSON mashup of this. But the notion is basically that any given request will have a source. The source is usually, it gives it there as the request source. There can be like a query intermediary instead that I showed in the picture. And you might want to have that separately identify itself because sometimes there could be different authorization policies depending on kind of what intermediary request gets through to get to the service. Typically, right now, you'll notice there is one subject. This is something I've gone back and forth about. Like I change this in the data model like every 2 weeks. Right now, there's one subject, but the restrictions are a set. And this is an example of the SMS one. Yes, Jean.
Jean Mahoney. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Asking for a JabberScribe. I'm the only person in the Jabber room, but I'm taking notes. Okay. So if somebody would like to, and people in the Jabber room would like a JabberScribe.
Oh, I'd say there are people in the Jabber room. Dr. Berger, hello. Oh, that's me to go. Oh, yeah. Where's the Jabber thing? Oh, there's one. Okay.
So can we get somebody to?
Yeah. So yeah, this is exactly what I'm talking about how these kinds of restrictions work. Of course, again, I know it would be great to have a JabberScribe. Can anyone here please subscribe to the? Do I need to go on strike until there's JabberScribing? Because it's been a long week, and frankly, labor disputes are.
I suck at it, but I'll do it because no one else is.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, when we actually imagine how the semantics would be mapped onto a RESTful API, somehow probably the subject would end up being mirrored in the URL or whatever. But just take this for the moment as just a data object that's intended to convey everything there would be in a request. Next slide. And this is a good example of a response. You talk to that service, and that server says, I don't know who you are. I have no reason to give you anything. So yeah, we're going to have a number of different response codes like this identified. Right now, they're just done as text in TeRi. Like we're building an information model. At some point, we will go through this exercise of turning this all into like actual code points that do something useful. Next. So I've already talked a lot about records. It's important to appreciate before we get into this use case especially, that we imagine this concept of a service as being, a repository for these records that could be network remote, or could be that something that's kind of local that you're dipping through TeRi as an API, right? We want to have a way to distribute these records out radically and to flood and propagate and so on, so that for some kinds of networks and applications of this, it makes a lot of sense to have every record that is relevant to everything, be it every TeRi service that is co-located with everybody that's actually going to use the application. There are certainly use cases we're considering that have very much that property. We certainly assume that there could be multiple records associated with the TN in much the same way that there can be multiple credentials associated with the TN. I mean, when you look at the way numbering works in North America, you can have a carrier who then gives some numbers to a reseller, who then gives numbers to an enterprise, who then gives numbers to an individual user. Well, potentially all of those entities could create records of some kind. And the question, again, of whether or not you use records, you as a relying party of the retrieval interface who kind of gets these records from a TeRi service, it's entirely based on whether or not you trust the authority that created it. And so it could be in like carrier environments, carrier trusts the records other carriers made, but is not so interested in what a user made, for example. But the whole TeRi service could contain a mix of these records. And again, through restrictions, you could winnow those down to the ones you're interested in. There are all kinds of possibilities like this that arise from the way that we've designed it. And yeah, we obviously, because of the way that the modern framework is designed, we have to accommodate things like government entities, which is a component of that. The notion there are entities that will have privileged access to TeRi services. It's the fact of life. To ignore it would not be productive for getting the protocol that we need to have. Next slide. Here's a, I should have put this slide earlier. Here's an example of what a TeRi success response looks like and what a record actually might look like in the middle of this. And again, these are mock-ups. Let's not, I'm sure the syntax is broken here and there. Let's not dwell on that at the moment. But the basic idea is the records are going to have an identifier. And this lets you uniquely identify them so that if, say, you're using the management interface and you want to update a record because you are cruddy, you want to push an entire copy of it, you need to use that identifier, right, to make sure that you can figure out which record you're trying to replace. The example of an authority of a signature that lets you know who it was that actually generated this record. And in this instance, records can have multiple subjects. That isn't true of requests, but it is true of records. In other words, there can be a record that gives the same basic data about a very wide range of numbers, actually. And we have this concept in the framework of a distinction between administrative data and service data. Frankly, it's still a little vague what we mean by that, but administrative data is a perfect example of something where you might have a record that applies to a ton of numbers, because what it really tells you is like these are all Comcast's numbers, right? And like it's just some like piece of administrative data like that isn't actually used in the resolution of a call or figuring out how to route it or whatever. It's just there so you can do like, accounting or whatever it is you need to do like that. So does this stuff so far, TeRi, seem clear to people? Because people kind of get where we're going with this, and like, are people here who think that we should be doing something different? Because I ask this a lot because I'm now on, again, my third revision of TeRi, and it's not a group item yet. It should be at some point, probably, if we're going to get serious about this. I don't know if it needs to be today, but if there's a need for course correction, this would be a great time to let us know. We have like another proposal to do things differently than this. Anyway. Next. Oh, sorry.
Well, maybe just another point to your previous comment about administrative data. You also need a security association with who can actually modify the data.
Yes.
So if that provider owns that telephone number, they're only allowed to modify it until the time that it's ported or whatever else.
Also true. Yeah. I mean, an authority can always create a record, right, for something they don't have authority for. But the purpose of tying this to the STIR-like credentials is presumably if you're making a record for a telephone number, you should have the OCN, right, that number is in. And if you don't, that should actually show up as a security failure. It should be detectable in the system. And I think it is. I think there's no like hole in that, though I'll be the first one to say that it's not like we've built the system yet that behaves that way, right? Next slide. Here's this point. I don't quite think CRUD, I think SCRUD. But I do think of it as a life cycle matter. There's an ecosystem that these records exist in, that there's this concept of the registry, which is kind of the root of numbering authority for a given chunk of modern. And modern doesn't necessarily assume one world government behind this, just that there are apex points of registries that are the places that registrars get numbers from. How those people get related to each other and what the deal is with that is business relationships and stuff that is outside the scope, at least what we're trying to accomplish here. We just need to acknowledge that they exist. Paul would like to speak to that.
Paul Hoffman. So that was sort of my question on the search part. So how do I know where to search if I know if I know about this tree, I can search in that tree. Tree discovery or tree linkage, I didn't see anything in here. Is there a plan sort of for later of at least an informal like picture of a tree? It doesn't have to be formal like this is it, but a way for me to first ask somebody, if I'm asking about this, which apex do I want to go to? Is that sort of a thought?
It could be. So that people have studied this for telephone numbers in a couple different places here, like eCrit did this with its lost protocol, which is based on trees and these things are called forest guides that let you find the trees that you're looking for. And it's based on the same principle that all you have is a telephone number. How do you figure out what the thing is you need to talk to? So it's been studied. We aren't making a specific recommendation yet, but definitely agreed that at some point we need to say what that's going to be.
And we would need to, unless this was just for a tree, right?
Yeah.
Am I understanding that correctly?
Probably. I mean, I only caveat that because, of course,
this is for search. I mean, I know who my telephone provider is or my intended telephone provider who I want to get a number. Oh, actually, no, I don't. If I want number foo, I don't know who to ask for number foo.
Well, so a lot of these things, again, assume that there are these like national numbering authorities and that these are like regulated and that there are going to be incentives to create systems that the participants in this are going to know.
But I'm talking about the user knowing about that.
No, I got it. Again, in the telephone network.
I mean, no one in this country, we're in Czechia, I don't know, no one in the U.S. has ever heard of NANP. For a reasonable value of no one.
I think that as an implementation problem, I'm not immensely worried about being able to get implementations that would rely on something like this. In other words, if you know enough to even be using the retrieval interface of this, then I suspect that I can, for North America at least, I can take care of that.
Okay, great.
Chris went. So I think both John and I have contributed our opinions on different data models, and I think that was the path we were heading down, to have a particular data model with specific indexes that you can query, specific relationships between those data objects. I don't think it'll actually be a tree at the end of the day. I think it'll just be more of a relational model.
Bucket of records.
Yeah.
I mean, I think Paul's point was more like, if we assume that every TeRi record is not propagated to every TeRi service and that there are different records resident in different places provisioned there by authorities, how do you find the right service for the record that you need? And that is an implementation question about how you would actually operate a system like this. And there are a bunch of design decisions you could make about how to do that.
Yeah, but I think we can make that explicit, right?
We could, or
it'll have to be a core model that has some extensibility, right, to add more objects.
But at some point, like an Addis or something is going to say, oh, well, so if you're a North American carrier, you're going to do this, right? IETF isn't going to say that, but somebody is eventually.
Yeah, but I think there's probably logical roles that I think have actually been identified to them for the most part, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, we've already got like all the actors that is talked about and how they interact, right?
We should make sure it's extensible for sure,
right?
And that people can expand on it. But there's probably some core telephone record model. Well, we've already identified a few. I think we just need to come together on, and I think we're close actually.
Yeah.
Tom McGarry, News Star. I think we cover at least some of this when in the framework document where we talk about distributed versus central registries. At least that's what I think. It may not say that, but I think that there's going to be multiple ways to, we envision multiple ways to do this. And One place may want it centralized so you know where to search, and another place may want it distributed so your service provider, your favorite service provider, helps you do that. That's how I've thought about it anyhow.
We do have that language in the framework.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, to me, centralized versus distributed is an independent thing of the data model itself, like whether I get it from one database versus a distributed set of databases, the data should still be the same and the query should still be the same. And just want to clarify that.
That is true of the model. Yes, TeRi works that way. So yeah, right now, because we are trying to keep this to kind of SCRUD-ish limits, like there's no concept of like uploading a delta about a record or anything like that. If you're going to replace a record, you replace the record. That's just like how the model works right now. Maybe later we'll care, because some of these records could be quite large, is the point. Maybe later we will care about that, but we don't care about it now. And any authority can update or delete its own records. You kind of can't have authorities like clobbering each other's records, but again, it doesn't matter if multiple authorities are talking about the same thing, because it really comes down to the conscience of the relying party to determine which authorities they trust and why. And there will be business relationships and various things like that that dictate that will make that all work just like it works today, probably. Next slide. So I've already talked about these things. I don't want to go into this too much. So there is an acquisition operation. This is what's in it. These are the kinds of responses you get. I'm just going to flash through these. Next slide. Management. Like in management, if you have a record in the query, what you're really saying is probably, hey, put this record in. This is a provisioning interface for this. There could also in the management interface be records and responses in some cases. Next. And retrieval, everybody's favorite, the enum replacement. And yeah, that's the gist. Next one, keep going. We've got this. So this is what we actually want to talk most about today. Now we've done the refresher course on TeRi. Everyone is aware there exists such a thing as TeRi and basically what it does. Okay, so here's a use case. Here's something you could actually like do with this now. And it's the problem space that's much discussed in North America today, because there are a lot of abusive callers in North America today who are using numbers that are either invalid or unallocated. And by unallocated, I mean no carrier even has them in inventory. Yeah, and I'm sure this is true in many other places. And so what we want to try to do with TeRi, with this model, is to figure out how to share information about blocks of valid and allocated numbers that can be propagated around to carriers so that calls can be either blocked completely at the carrier level or at least subject to some special treatment. In different jurisdictions, there are different kind of appetites, right, for letting carriers actually prevent end users from receiving calls. We aren't going to make a judgment about that here anyway. We're just creating the tools that could be used to implement whatever people think the appropriate policies are for remediation of this. And this seems like a good modern use case, right? The kinds of things we're talking about can't do this. We're probably barking up the wrong tree, right? So let's do this, because other things we talked about, because they're either too far in the future or whatever, I think it's been harder for people to get their teeth around. This is something that's tangible today that I think the stuff we're doing should be able to do this, or we got a problem. Next slide. So yeah, the idea is there's a restriction now for allocated. Right now, we try to do this in the barest bones possible way. You basically to say, I'm only interested in information that exists in records about whether or not this number is allocated at this time. Now, I've cast this here as a request, and this is an important caveat you see down at the bottom bullet. A request doesn't necessarily mean a network dip. I'm not suggesting that, oh, if you're a carrier, like every time you receive a call, you're going to go talk to some service in the cloud and wait for it to get a response before you progress it. This is an API that can either be based on a network dip like that or be local. In other words, if you have all the records propagated down to you as a carrier locally, this query operation is something that just happens over, your Ethernet or your whatever, right? So, we don't want to suggest that we're saying everybody needs to do queries like this. It's just this is a useful API for us to talk about how to access records in the TeRi information model. Next slide. And this is what a response might look like. The interesting thing about this response, which says allocated unknown, which basically means we're taking a whitelist approach to this. We're assuming that and this is something Tom raised on the list we're going to talk about as an open issue in a bit. There are kind of a few levels of allocated that we consider. Unknown just means, yes, these are valid numbers. Yes, some carrier has them, but we don't know if the carrier has given them out yet or not, is what unknown means. And we'll get into the three semantics that we have for this in a minute. But the interesting thing about this response is this is a great example of a TeRi request that leads to a response that has a record that encloses the number that was the subject of the request. So the request asked about a specific number under 212.555.1. But this particular pooled 1000 block has just one record that governs it that indicates its allocation status. And so that's what you end up getting back when you ask for, hey, are there any records for this number that are allocated? Yeah, you get this enclosing record for that entire number block that gives you the allocation information that you want. And yeah, so we don't even have like a separate thing that means like a number is valid because we're doing this as a whitelist approach. In other words, we thought about this initially. Should you have like a blacklist, right, where you say all the possible ways somebody could create an invalid number, or what it would be like to say what number ranges are not currently allocated? And we decided it's just simpler actually to figure out how to talk about what numbers actually are valid and are allocated, the ones that aren't. And whitelists in general have better security properties for a variety of reasons. I don't want some guy to like outsmart me because the semantics that I devised for what an invalid number possibly could be has some like loophole in it that I didn't see, right? And then we're screwed. So I'd rather just have it be, here's all the blocks of allocated numbers. Yes, Bernie.
Bernie Höneisen, is there a concept of saying in the same answer, well, I don't know really, but this guy knows more about it, like query this authority?
Sure. So that would be a separate response code. There are response codes you can get back that have that. The record wouldn't say that as such. So in other words, a TeRi response can have that response in it, but we probably wouldn't make a record that means I don't know anything about this.
Yeah, that's what it's doing here. Basically, this response says, I don't know anything about it, but it could include like, I don't know, but the other guy knows a bit more because we allocated a whole block of numbers to this authority.
So let's get to this later discussion of what we mean by allocated, because I think that'll clarify a bit why we have this like unknown thing here. This is presuming it is effectively unknowable. In other words, that data is not public data that is being released by people intentionally. Yeah.
Paul Hoffman, so going back to the request, I don't see how to do ranges, and I didn't see that in the draft.
So you can. There's an R, so you can have a subject of R. Yeah, R means range.
In the request?
Yeah, the subject can have R in
Sorry.
it, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is okay, sorry. So I forget if we have an example where we actually have a subject with a request with a range in it. But yeah, T just means one number, R means range of numbers. And the only way to express range in this instance is prefix. We have another open issue in the data model of whether we want count to be a separate way of doing it. This is something we've killed ourselves over in certs, right, as well. Like, how do you express ranges? And prefixes are more common in some places, but not in others. And it may be that we need both. Oh, next slide, if we get the basic idea here. So this is the point that Tom raised in the list, and I think speaks to what you were saying as well, Bernie. Let me blow my nose here for a second. So the draft now intentionally pretty much conflates validity, allocation, and assignment. So in other words, there's like, we take it for granted that if the number is allocatable, that it's valid. I think that is a safe assumption, probably, that if a number is allocatable, it is valid. So in other words, if you have a record that says allocated no, what that means is this is a valid number, it is an allocatable number, but it is I'm absolutely sure that no number, that this individual number, if it's a range, no number in that range has been allocated yet, would be the meaning of that record. If you ask about a number that is literally invalid, that is unallocatable, there will be no records. And that's how you will know that that is an invalid number. So this is trying to use this one, right now the draft tries to use this one parameter to convey a couple different states of information, right? If you get back allocated and get back no, what that means is valid number, not allocated yet. No record means invalid number, can't be allocated, certainly shouldn't be originating calls. And then assignment is the third vector of this. So if you get back for an individual telephone number record, assignment equals yes, or allocated equals yes, that means that number is assigned. Someone has that number, it's a valid number, you call it, somebody will answer or something. If it's a range, what yes means is every number in that range is allocated. Unknown just means like, I don't know. Now this again was a bare bones, how much can we communicate with a single parameter just to get this discussion started. Tom raised on the list, why don't you decouple some of this at least? I guess there is a distinction between allocation and assignment that's like already in the literature of this, and that we could have allocated and assigned be hierarchical properties of this. In other words, a number must be allocated in order to be assigned. Those two are dependent properties. You can have a number that's assigned but not allocated, right? So we could add some further qualifier to allocated that then says and also assigned if we were so inclined to do so. I mean, I think that we can do that for the sake of being compliant with what this, terminology is that's being used elsewhere in the industry. But overall, I mean, I think this, for the purposes of beating the threat model that this represents, I think the information we have here is the information that we need. In other words, what you really need to know is this number valid and allocated, right? And if those things are true, right, then I think you have a sense of whether or not this should originate numbers. Having that kind of a real time, is this in real time assigned to some particular user? That's a property that we may need for future use cases. I would not take it off the table. I'd be willing to put in an extensibility point for that. But I think it is probably not germane to the actual North America problem today. Having said all that, there's a line in the queue. So Chris, yes.
Chris went. I feel like this could be a lot simpler, and I think like you're sort of trying to think of the implementation and the requirements at the same time. And to me, a number block is either allocated or not, and a telephone number, which may be in that number block, obviously it will be in some number block, but you can have a property of both allocated or assigned, or both. Unknown. To me, that's just either unknown or it hasn't been allocated. Is just you query for that telephone number block or number, and you get a 400 response. Like the record doesn't exist.
No. So what unknown is supposed to mean in this model is allocated, but I don't know the assignment status in real time because I can't tell you what numbers AT&T has assigned in the last 10 minutes. So we need to create these records that have a bit of longevity to them, is one of the components of this, right? Mm-hmm. So I think it's a way of saying, this is a record we know is allocated. The assignment of what this range, right, has been allocated. The assignment of that is somebody else's problem. What an unknown, that's how the unknown is defined in the draft today. Now we can define something else we like better, but that's what it's supposed to mean today.
Why do we want to separate that?
I'm sorry?
Why do we want to separate that?
We can separate it. I'm not here to say don't separate it. We're
going
to have allocated and assigned. Like I said, they'd be hierarchical properties.
Okay, I'm just trying to understand the psychology there.
Well, my point is that I think that unknown is fine for determining DNO, do not originate.
I'm just saying if it's DNO should be, I query for that number and it doesn't exist in the registry and I get an error back saying no, nothing.
Sure. Well,
can it be that simple?
So that's what happens
if it's assigned or allocated, it exists. If it's not, then it doesn't exist.
Okay. No, I mean that's about right. That's about right.
I'm just trying to say maybe think it's a little more simple. I mean, we should define what allocated and assigned and those things mean. And if there's a need for unknown, we can discuss that as well. But keep the model.
Yeah, we can keep it allocated and assigned. If that's more intuitive to people, I have no problem with that. And again, this was Tom's suggestion, so that's Paul.
Actually, not Paul. I'm Eric Berger.
Eric, I don't care what you think about this. Okay, I'll hear you out.
Two questions.
Yeah.
Eric just sends a smile by the way to that. Is there any practical difference between valid but not allocated versus invalid? I'm blocking on numbers not assigned to people. Do I care if a carrier is holding it? So I think that was just the discussion we just sort of had. So
I mean,
so
again,
multiple people are having this question.
Like I said, it's I think I have been presuming that real-time assignment data is unavailable to the system. Because I believe in North America, real-time assignment information is unavailable to this system. But I mean, I think it'll be a no-op to do this, which is why I'm like saying the best I can say about it is unknown. Well, if you want to if you can give me real-time allocation data, real-time assignment data for your network, like I would be happy to use it, right? But
real-time is fuzzy, but I think that can. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Adam. Yeah.
Adam Roach. So this is kind of up-leveling a bit. I think the document is a good illustration of like how TeRi works, in a very practical sense. But I have some confusion about how we think this is going to play out if it's actually deployed in making the problem better rather than worse.
Right.
Because what I see is, game theory this out, right? This is deployed. People start getting, the calls, they're originating from unallocated numbers, stop doing what they want to do. They move to allocated numbers
I got it.
because they're spoofing. And then you have blowback, right? So it's...
The DNO list is the rock, stir is the hard place.
Okay, so that was the second part, is like, if we know how we're going to solve that problem, we probably want a little bit of that analysis in this document.
Okay. So that is the rough bit. And I'll explain that for the benefit of everyone else here. So,
Thanks.
I mean, if we drive people away from using invalid numbers, what they'll do is spoof valid numbers, right? And that would just make things worse, wouldn't it? Well, but if we have stir, then you're not going to be spoofing valid numbers anymore, is the argument, right? So we're trying to drive from multiple sides to get this addressed.
I think the important thing is don't deploy this until
right. Don't deploy
stir invalid numbers, because that makes it worse, not better.
I mean, it's I've heard various arguments about this, right? About when people do choose, for example, to spoof valid numbers, where they choose them from. Henning's studied this a bit, and there's notorious prefixes in Washington State that people use. So I mean, there's all kinds of things that end up factoring into how that happens. Well, I know I get the most robocalling personally from things that match my own NPA and XX.
Sure.
That's Jeff.
Jim Reed. I think upon my gut feel is we'll have to have this separation, John, between these different categories of unknown allocated, maybe some other kind of potential error codes in there too.
Sure.
I've not really thought enough about this, but I've got vague memories of something that goes back to the days of the ENUM wars. And we had a particular problem there that was to do with voice operators who would then be doing an ENUM lookup in certain cases. And you needed somebody to signal back to the VoIP operator, there's nothing here. Don't attempt to dump this call back to the PSTN, which would be the normal thing that would have happened if they got an NX domain response.
Mm-hmm.
So you need to have a NAPTA record that said there's nothing here.
Yep.
So we might need to have something similar in this particular scenario. So there may be similar things we've got with VoIP providers or whatever, where we need to signal to them, don't attempt to do anything beyond this point. Stop now. There's nowhere else to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do remember that now that you mention it. And again, the problems with that are very similar to the problems with the rest of enum. So I think that was the blacklist approach instead of whitelist, first of all, where it's like, this is something you shouldn't go back to the PSTN with. Don't do it if this record is present. I don't want that to be the way this works, where I have to think of every record that needs to be put in.
Yeah.
That means don't do this.
But the specific scenarios when VoIP providers had configured their SIP gateways to do things like, if there's nothing here that you can find in the enum or in some other SIP repository, dump it to the PSTN. You may have somebody to say, don't dump it to the PSTN because there's nothing there.
Yep. That takes me back. That was probably 15 years ago now.
Sorry about that, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm having flashbacks too.
I've been doing this for too long, by the way. Chris.
Chris Wendt. So maybe just to provide some perspective, if you'll indulge me, from from service provider community, just as in STIR, as we sort of took the approach of starting with service provider certificates only and then entertain the fact, sort of the crawl, walk, run approach. That's much more practical to deploy in a very big network that, with multiple players and everything else. I think this really represents something that, and maybe just to go back to the real-time thing, we need something that has maybe not millisecond real-time, but, relative real-time updates on what the status of numbers are.
I mean, I'd love to get
and that's the strategic goal, right?
Yes.
And this seems to be a very practical use case where we can get it out there. Yes, there's going to be issues with maybe you're going to push spam providers, spam call actors into the allocated number space, but we already have problems with all of the above. So this is just the first step in many to get to the point where we can control all the numbers and just push the ball forward into a real-time registry where we can be sort of all-knowing at the end of the day.
Yeah, and just for people who don't know this as well, there's regulatory activity about this in North America, going on right now. People asking these questions about how to get these lists of valid, invalid, allocated, unallocated numbers. So this is like a thing right now going around. Yeah.
Tom McCary, News Star. I just wanted to give a little more background on what you were just getting into, and also first say that I think this is a great opportunity to put out a TeRi draft of a use case that we can understand, and the discussion in the room is really great because we're now discussing, the records and, and access to it. The allocated versus assigned kind of goes back, at least in the U.S. To the 90s when we almost, blew up our numbering plan. We almost had to go past 10 digits because of competition, local competition, where we gave everybody telephone numbers, 10,000 blocks. And the industry really wanted to know, okay, how many of these, we know how many we're giving out, we're allocating, how many were actually assigned. So we implemented something else where we take inventory once or twice a year from carriers. And now we basically know that of the X amount that we allocate, there is about 50% assigned. That's what we've gotten to, and that's the best we can do. So that's where the first discussion of this came around. Then the robocalling problem, from what I understand, there were companies that would actually look for recently unassigned telephone numbers, thinking that they would be more likely to be picked up. So they would actually try and find who has disconnected, give me this number, and assign it. I do think, I think ultimately, but ideally you'd get to a point where allocated meant assigned. That it was one and the same thing. But I think we're ways from there. I think it would change what the carriers do significantly in order to do that. But that's kind of where these concepts came up, and they are viewed as very different things. The allocated versus assigned.
Okay, and I think I said from moment one, we'll make it both allocated and assigned. It's fine. That'll change to that.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment, that ultimately, at the end of the day, it won't matter whether it's allocated or assigned. It should be both.
Right.
And everything should be real time.
Yes.
And single numbers. Number blocks was only just to have enough inventory because you didn't have a real time database, right?
Yeah. No, I hear you. I'm kind of fading here, I think. So yes, we'll get this to be a finer distinction. This will be allocated and assigned. Next slide. It's kind of a related point. So right now we kind of created two approaches to this, where we're going to use ranges for things like traditional North American numbering plan blocks, and then have individual TNs. And the example we always give of individual TN allocation is free phone, right? Like if today you go get like an 800 number, you don't like go to your carrier and get like a block of 800 numbers, right? Carriers don't have inventories of those. There are these REST-orgs that are responsible for, there's this whole like registry system, much like with domain names, right? Where you go and get 800 numbers from these effectively registrars and then get carriers to operate them for you. So we kind of have these two ways of doing it in there now. I could certainly see us taking those and saying, okay, one of those is now the allocated one and the other one is the assigned one. Like that's a way to implement what we just described. And to say, we only talk about allocation for the ranges, we only talk about assigned for the individual numbers. The way that the draft is written today, again, if what it means when you say that an entire block is allocated is effectively that it's assigned, that every number in this block of 1,000 is assigned. That may not be a useful metaphor. It may be more useful to just have allocated be this yes, no, and then there is this separate property of assigned that applies only to individual TNs. I mean, right now they're not in any way hierarchical the way they're described. They could, they're just separate. Kind of what I took away from the previous discussion is maybe we should have that be hierarchical from them. Right, we say, okay, if we're going to have it be allocated and then assigned. The like actual concern about that though is this thing in the TeRi model of what authority is for these things, right? For authority is for a record. And, we want to allow the possibility that, say, a carrier has this block of numbers and they have delegated some amount of them, say, to an enterprise, and that the enterprise is going to be doing signatures for these things. If we have the kind of what it means to be assigned be part of the same record that the carrier creates to describe its allocation, then hierarchically, like it'll be the carrier's signature that's over that whole thing. And the enterprise kind of doesn't have a way to present its record for that then. So maybe I would like it better if they were separate. this way. It still gives the same thing when there's these two properties, right? Where one's allocated, one's assigned. It's just the assignment property is tied to this individual TN concept. Is that okay with you, or?
Well, yeah, I think, well, specific to TN relationship to a number block, I mean, to me, that's just a parent-child relationship. And right now, typically, most people are allocating blocks, obviously, and picking numbers out of those. But if we do have the future where we're just dealing with individual numbers, then maybe that number,
Well, but
if it's not
right.
part of a block, it doesn't have a parent or, parent.
Well, that's my point, that for free phone today, you don't have a parent.
Right.
Right. I mean, for 800 today, there is no parent for those numbers. So
Yeah,
this isn't a future
right.
problem. This is a today problem.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Sure.
So, I mean, I think we kind of need to, at least, if we're going to support that case at all, have those things be separable. Whether or not
Yeah.
they're always separate, they need
Right.
to be separable.
Yep. And the relation, I mean, it can be sort of an inheritance thing, right? Like a number block can have the authority for now, and then TNs inherit that. But then if a TN is a singleton on its own, it has all the properties of, the authority and the ownership and all that stuff.
And I think it goes beyond that too, in that, like the way the TeRi model is designed, again, there can be multiple authorities that are assigning records that would match the same search, in the sense of there can be a record for the block and a record for the individual TN, one that comes from the carrier and one that comes from the enterprise. They can both live in the service. When you do a retrieval, you'll get one or the other. If you trust only the carrier, you'll only listen to that one. If you trust the enterprise one, you trust that one, right? That's fundamental to the way the TeRi ecosystem is supposed to work. The Jabber room intervenes.
Yeah, relaying for Eric.
Yes, Mr. Berger. Dr. Berger, sorry.
The comment was, and I apologize, I can't place it in exact context. You'll have to figure it out.
Okay.
Except in a number portability regime, you do not have nice allocation of solid blocks, i.e.
Right.
you don't have a nice hierarchy of 1,000 blocks all sitting with a single carrier.
That is yet another reason why I like these things to be separate. Because, of course, because of porting, because a number could be ported out of your block and end up somewhere else.
Well, that's why I go back to having a very well-defined object relationship model.
Well, I mean,
and we sort of have to start with that for these core concepts.
Because these records have subjects, they're always indexable.
Yeah.
Again, provided you have a search function. You need the search in SCRUD to be able to have that flexibility. But I mean, it's not like, if you're inspecting all the records in a service, you're not gonna be able to tell that these records are connected by the fact that this number is enclosed in this other number range, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you search the database, you'll get the records that applies to.
Right.
So they're all, I mean, I almost don't understand what we buy from having them literally be hierarchical, in the sense of, if we know they can be detached, and we know that if you need to figure out what the relationship is between them, if you want to know which carrier owns the block that this number is in, just search the number and you'll get the carrier's record, right? And like the carrier will assign it. So it's
right,
not
but
like,
that's what I'm saying.
Right.
A number has a relationship to a block, has a relationship to an authority, has a relationship to a carrier or multiple carriers, and we define those 1 to n, 1, 0, whatever relationships, and make it very clear from a logical point of view.
Tom McGarry, New Star. Not to belabor this, I'll be brief. But if prefixes, right, you'd want to know information about a prefix. Is it allocated? Is it not allocated? And those aren't necessarily allocated to carriers, or is it free phone? Is it not free phone? That type of thing.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. So I guess what I'm taking away from that, I mean, so I agree that we need to have that indexing property in the database to be able to figure out how these records are correlated. But I think a clean way to implement the distinction that we want to have between the allocated and the assigned is roughly this, right? Is to say the allocated will treat more as the block level designation for this, and the assignment will always be to an individual TN is something that's assigned. A block in this would never be assigned. Is that okay, Chris?
Yeah, I think that's what I said before.
Yeah, I think so. Well, okay, yeah.
Right, but we'll also have allocated and assigned for individual TNs as well. That's what you're saying also,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It's just that the record that is for an individual TN that will contain this attribute that says assigned in it, is that attribute is not going to be in the TN block.
Yeah, I mean, if it's, I guess at the end of the day, if it's assigned, you're assuming it's allocated, right?
Yes.
So that's fine.
Okay, great. Perfect. So I'll do that. That sounds like fun. Next slide. This is something that is just broader, like a to-do for Chris and I, that we really need to figure out what our story is about how you propagate out records like this. I mean, if you look at how many records you really need to model the North American Numbering Plan, just to say which prefixes are allocated, it's not a ton, right? Not when you compare this to like Facebook or something, right? And the records themselves, again, they're going to have these lists of TNs in them. We could bundle a lot of them into one record, or we could have individual records for each of them as we see fit. Probably along administrative lines is the way that makes the most sense for how to approach that. But we need to have some better story than we have today about how you propagate those records out so that every carrier has a copy of every record that they need for allocation to make these real-time call processing decisions to know that a number is valid or not. And we've kind of like spitballed what that should be, but that we need to actually do that if this is going to be serious. And we just haven't done it yet, right? So it could be that is a drip-like story. And we could talk about drip in a bit.
Yeah, I was going to say we did a little more than spitballing, didn't we?
We have more spitballing to do. But it also could just be that the management interface is used to share records kind of peer-to-peer between services. We kind of allude to that in TeRi today, but since we're not getting down to the concrete implementation of this, of the transport effectively for these records, because we're not doing that, like, that's probably where most of that would live. Next slide. That's it. So like, this is often starved for energy. It just seems like every time we should be working on this, there's something else that is more important. STIR has been more important for a long time. Now the core STIR docs are getting to be RFCs. Of course, now there's a million extensions to STIR. Now I'm racking my brain to solve STIR out of band and things like that. And then there's ACME and all the stuff we need to do in ACME now, which is going to rack our brains as well, because we need that for the cert steps to support STIR. However, I think there probably is enough energy, especially if we treat something practical like this, to get something like this done to the point where TeRi isn't just a hypothetical sketch anymore. And if people here think that this is a good use case for us to go pursue for this, then we could actually maybe do some good with it, I'm happy to put a little fire under it. That's kind of what I'm thinking. And, again, we would use this as a way to flesh out TeRi as we go, right, is the idea. Just take this use case. We've got TeRi somewhat specified. Well, as we get deeper into this, we'll get the encodings and things like that and the transports down to the point where this is actually practicable. Anybody have any Dayquil? Because I could really use some Dayquil. Okay.
Not with you, but I can do it.
Yeah, Sudafed, I got the good stuff. All right, so that's all I got. That's it. That's my last slide.
Okay.
Would the chairs like to ask any questions in the room about any of this, or I don't know? People here generally think this is a good idea, but people out here are like, why are you bothering to do this? Like, people in here. Is it the last place there's working Wi-Fi in the venue now, or?
It's a trivial, almost administrative question, but do you envision if this work were to go forward that you just merge this into the TeRi document, or do you see this progressing by its own?
I guess I'd still keep them separate. Okay. I don't want to have that become too cumbersome. But for right now, I kind of like having, here's where you specify the information model. Here's where you specify how we're encoding that information model. And then this is like a practical use case that shows like a profile of it and how you actually do it, right? This one valid thing. Okay. I don't mind keeping three things. Eventually, I would merge that encoding into core TeRi when I'm comfortable with it, but I'm not comfortable with it yet. And I want the transport stuff to be done before I did that too. In other words, like, what is the actual API like? And that would involve solving this propagation stuff and things like that.
Okay, thanks.
So my question is whether we should turn these into working group drafts.
What's that?
Should we turn these into working group drafts?
Well, I think at this point, like, unless somebody really has a better idea than TeRi, I'm kind of tired of like incrementing it and it not being adopted. So yeah, I think we should probably adopt TeRi.
Mr. Eric Berger says, given that TeRi is still looking for a solid use case, and from today's discussion, we are still looking for a direction, would it not make more sense to keep it individual until something solid emerges?
Is this not sufficiently solid? This is terra firma compared to where we've been then.
Okay, well, Eric didn't seem to hear a solid use case, so.
Dude, read the NPRM. I'm sorry, you've already read it.
I'm waiting to see if he's typing. He doesn't seem to be typing, so the response was, dude, we have a solid use case.
Chris went, Comcast. I can reiterate the use case that we're talking about here. Basically, from a do not originate point of view, the best the industry has is a Excel spreadsheet
It's an Excel search
of numbers that we shouldn't. So I think we can do a little better here. And we, even in the FCC strike force, we discussed a path forward for, even though we didn't have a specific solution, we knew some of these things were on the horizon. As I stated before, evolving the industry to be more confident about the numbers it can block because they're either unallocated or unassigned or whatever, seems to be a very positive direction forward.
And Eric follows up with, I guess we have use cases, but not at all clear how TeRi solves it.
I mean, I wrote this draft. It's not great or anything, but it shows TeRi objects that have records that contain things that do this. I mean, I don't know what else to do other than that.
Right. Adam Roach, I agree. The TeRi ballot in particular, I think, shows a useful use case, that meets some real requirements that we're putting out there, listening to Chris, by regulators right now, right? There's a gap. It sounds like we have the tools to fill it here.
We have a tool, right? It might not be awesome, but we've been sitting here for a long time talking about what to do with these tools, and I don't know. Somebody has a better tool. Let's see it.
Okay, well, I will take it to the list, but
Sure.
We're talking TeRi specifically, or the TeRi ballot also.
So I mean, I would let's start with getting TeRi adopted,
Right.
this because it just cascades down from there, right? I mean,
Okay, very good. So does anybody need the blue sheet? Yeah, and there's at least one person that needs it also. Right there. Okay. Drip.
So for drip, I will fully confess that.
Something strange happened.
Assistive technology. Wow.
I think these computers offering to read it out loud.
I don't need to be up here.
My son used my computer for some law school stuff, and how do I go? How do I get post view?
View, yeah. Great.
Post view.
There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, so I've gone through drip a few times in the past. I'm fully willing to go through a review again. Sort of gauge, who's new here, and I'm happy to go through it again, but we don't need to if everybody's already heard the story. I don't see any clamoring. I'll still provide a higher level overview, and you can ask specific questions if needed, and I have slides to complement that. So the idea behind drip is really the ability. So as John alluded to, when you're doing real-time call processing, doing an HTTP query all the way back to some centralized database is probably not a good idea. So and distributed databases, are in very wide use at this point. It's a proven technology. So the idea is that you have a registry that uses a gossip style protocol where if there's an update on a single node in the distributed mesh, that change will get propagated among all the nodes in the network in fair amount of real time. Depends on the size of the mesh, obviously, but I think for all practical purposes, we're talking about a reasonable size mesh for the use cases we're looking at. And the idea is that, update gets pushed, you have it available, and then you have it available in a local database that could be queried in a matter of hopefully milliseconds versus hundreds of milliseconds or seconds or whatever the case may be. So yeah, it follows most conventions. The big thing about DRIP was that we tried to take a fairly straightforward approach. We also tried to be very conscious of avoiding any race conditions or problems, making it extremely reliable, and you know exactly when you may have an issue with data, and that you request explicitly getting updates. So just making sure it's as reliable as possible. It follows similar conventions to other protocols out there. I guess one issue is the industry has, there's a bunch of open source projects that have defined distributed protocols. As far as I'm aware, there is none in the IETF. So this is basically the effort to make sure we have that defined, we have control of what we're doing it, and make sure it's supports all the requirements that we have in modern. If folks don't have any specific questions about it and are familiar with it, we can go to the last slide. I mean, I think at this point, I updated the document, but with only very extremely minor changes, really to renew the document. I think the argument is the same with TeRi. If we feel like we have a valid use case and we feel like there's no other inputs on this subject, should we consider it as a working group document? We also, as I've mentioned before, we have an implementation we're willing to open source so that the industry can play around and provide feedback. I think obviously if this will need a lot of testing and operational experience to go into it to be very confident about it. So that's another dimension as well. Any specific comments, questions?
Hi, it's John again. I mean, I think we should do something like this at some point here, right? I think this again goes back to, as I mentioned at the start, the FCC workshop that inspired all this. We were talking about kind of alternative approaches to numbering that might be interesting. And I think one of the most interesting experiments we really do is one that used a distributed registry system like this to allow kind of real-time allocations from a mixed number block from carriers. I think it'd be a really cool thing to do is that kind of experiment. So definitely it's always been my plan to get us here, right? I've always wanted to get us here. And she was like, what order we should do things in, or what is most useful to do first. I mean, we have reconciliation work to do to figure out how DRIP and TeRi relate and kind of what that is about. But I think pretty much as soon as we at least have some idea of that, I think we're in good shape to adopt this. Sure.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts? Any concerns with adopting it? Who here has read the draft on DRIP? A few. Might be good to get a few more people looking at it too, but not hearing any objections. I can bring it to the list and see if we have objections on adopting it.
It's Björn Höneisen. I have not read the draft. I'm just trying to figure out what you're doing. But this sounds to me like a problem that could be solved with DNS. So what is the reason you are proposing something else?
Well, I think the problem is, from a data model point of view, Um, we need something that can adapt TeRi-like objects. So to me, that's one barrier to entry. Yeah, I haven't thought about justifying it from that point of view for a little while. I guess the other, maybe the only other argument I have is this seems to be the common model for doing distributed. Well, yeah, I mean that's it. Yeah, I don't know. Good point. It's something to consider.
I'm not sure if it's a good idea or not, but just questioning.
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Since it's getting late in the day, we can have the humorous at the mic. At least the proposal is not blockchain. Otherwise, okay.
We did discuss that in a past meeting. Yes.
Okay, well, we can continue this on the list, and if we'll see what kind of feedback we get on the list for promoting it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So that's all we had presentation-wise. We had a slot for discussion if there's anybody has anything else they want to bring up today. Seems like we made good progress. Hopefully, we can get some more energy on the list now if we start advancing some work. It has been pretty sleepy, so if we can get some people commenting on the drafts and like John said, we have a more concrete use case now, so that should help. I don't know. We can try to keep you here for the rest of the meeting if we want to, but if not, John?
I think during the presentation, we hit on all the things that we wanted to discuss, actually.
Yeah. Okay, well, safe travels, everyone, and we'll see you in Singapore. And by the way, thanks to Gene for taking notes.
Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jim.